The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of Oakwood County Courthouse as 16-year-old Marcus Johnson adjusted his borrowed navy blue tie. His mother, Sarah, had spent an hour making sure everything was perfect. His white shirt pressed crisp, his black dress shoes polished to a shine, and his curly hair neatly trimmed the day before. They both believed that looking respectable would help their case, but neither knew they were walking into a courtroom where appearances wouldn't matter. Marcus stood straight, his hands trembling slightly as he faced Judge William Harrison. The judge's reputation preceded him in their small town of Millbrook, though few dared to speak openly about his questionable sentencing patterns. At 62 years old, with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes, Judge Harrison looked down from his bench with an expression that made Marcus's stomach twist into knots. Case number 2019 JD 1458, State versus Marcus Johnson, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. The charges seemed ridiculous to everyone who knew Marcus. He was accused of stealing $500 worth of electronics from Wilson's convenience store on Oak Street. The alleged theft had occurred on Tuesday, October 15th, between 4:30 and 5:00 p.m., exactly when Marcus had been stocking shelves at the public library, his after-school job for the past year. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly librarian, sat in the courtroom's third row. She had already testified about Marcus's presence at the library, even showing the signed timesheet and security camera footage that clearly showed him working during the supposed theft. 5 other witnesses, including 2 honor roll students and a retired teacher, had confirmed seeing Marcus at the library during that time. The evidence in Marcus's favor was overwhelming. His public defender, Mr. Rodriguez, had presented a solid case. Perfect alibi, spotless record, straight A student, active in community service, and a recommendation letter from the school principal. Even the convenience store's grainy security footage showed a suspect who was at least 5 inches shorter than Marcus. Your Honor, Mr. Rodriguez argued, standing with confidence, the evidence clearly shows that Marcus Johnson could not have committed this crime. We have multiple reliable witnesses, documented proof of his whereabouts, and security footage that doesn't match my client's physical description. Marcus is an honor student with a 4.0 GPA, volunteering weekly at the local food bank and. Judge Harrison raised his hand, cutting off the defense attorney mid-sentence. I've heard enough, Mr. Rodriguez. His voice carried a weight that silenced the courtroom. This court has seen many young men like Mr. Johnson, who believe their academic achievements place them above the law. Sarah Johnson gripped the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white. She watched as Judge Harrison shuffled some papers, not even bothering to look at the evidence photos spread before him. The security footage still played silently on the courtroom screen, showing a clearly different person committing the theft. Marcus Johnson, Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom, this court finds you guilty of grand theft. Given the serious nature of this crime and the need to set an example for other youth in our community, I am sentencing you to 2 years in juvenile detention. The courtroom erupted in gasps and mutters. Mrs. Wilson stood up, her voice shaking with anger. This is wrong. I told you he was with me. A bailiff moved toward her, gesturing for silence. Marcus stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. 2 years? For a crime he didn't commit. He felt his mother's arms wrap around him as she began to sob quietly. His dream of early college admission, his scholarship applications, his plans for the future. Everything was crumbling before his eyes. Mr. Rodriguez immediately began arguing for an appeal, but Judge Harrison was already standing up, gathering his robes around him. This court is adjourned, he announced, bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack that seemed to echo Marcus's shattering future. As the bailiff approached to take Marcus into custody, he caught a glimpse of someone else in the courtroom, a young woman about 19 or 20, with features similar to Judge Harrison's, watching the scene with a troubled expression. Unknown to Marcus at that moment, this was Emma Harrison, the judge's daughter, and this day would change her life as much as it was changing his. Marcus took one last look at his mother, trying to memorize her face, knowing he wouldn't see her outside of visiting hours for the next 2 years. I love you, Mom, he whispered as the bailiff gently but firmly led him away. Sarah Johnson stood there, tears streaming down her face, watching her innocent son being taken away while Judge Harrison disappeared through his chamber doors, completely unmoved by the lives he had just destroyed. Sarah Johnson hadn't slept properly in weeks. Her dining room table, once used for family meals with Marcus, was now covered with stacks of legal documents, newspaper clippings, and court records. Empty coffee cups littered the edges of the table as she worked through another late night, her reading glasses perched on her nose while she studied yet another case file. 2 months had passed since her son was wrongfully imprisoned. Every Wednesday and Sunday, she drove 45 minutes to visit Marcus at the juvenile detention center, watching helplessly as her once vibrant son grew quieter and more withdrawn. But Sarah was far from defeated. She was angry, and she was getting organized. "This isn't just about Marcus anymore," she explained to her sister Tracy, who came by every evening to help sort through documents. "Judge Harrison has been doing this for years." Sarah picked up a yellow legal pad filled with notes. She had started documenting every case Judge Harrison had presided over in the past decade, and the pattern was disturbing. During her day job as a community college professor, Sarah taught statistics. Now, those skills were proving invaluable. She created spreadsheets showing how Judge Harrison gave black defendants sentences that were, on average, 65% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. The numbers were shocking, but numbers alone wouldn't be enough. One rainy Tuesday, while grading papers in her office, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Wilson, the librarian who had testified for Marcus, walked in carrying a thick manila envelope. "I've been doing some digging of my own," Mrs. Wilson said, pulling out several old newspaper clippings. 10 years ago, Judge Harrison let a white teenager walk free in a shoplifting case with just community service. The evidence against him was solid, but his father played golf with the judge. She spread more articles across Sarah's desk. "And here's 3 more similar cases." Sarah's hands trembled as she read through the articles. "This could help prove the pattern of bias," she said, quickly adding the new information to her growing file. Word about Sarah's investigation spread through the community. More people started coming forward with their stories. A local civil rights attorney, James Martinez, reached out after hearing about her research. "What you've uncovered is significant," Martinez told her during their first meeting at his small office, "but we need to be strategic about how we use this information. Judge Harrison has powerful friends in this town." Sarah nodded, pulling out her carefully organized folders. "I've documented everything. Statistics, case histories, witness statements. I even found patterns in how he speaks to different defendants based on their race." She paused, taking a deep breath. "My son is sitting in juvenile detention while the real thief is probably still out there, and nobody seems to care." Martinez reviewed her materials, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is thorough work, Mrs. Johnson. With your permission, I'd like to bring this to the attention of the State Judicial Review Board. I also have contacts at the Equal Justice Initiative." While Sarah built her case, she continued her weekly visits to Marcus. Each visit broke her heart a little more. Her son, who once dreamed of becoming a doctor, now wore a gray juvenile detention uniform and spoke in whispers about surviving each day, but she made sure to keep his spirits up, telling him about her progress and the growing support from the community. "People are starting to notice baby," she told him during one visit. "Mrs. Wilson has been amazing, and we have a good lawyer now. We're going to fix this." Late one night, as Sarah was preparing for bed, her phone rang. It was an anonymous call from someone claiming to work at the courthouse. "Check Judge Harrison's records from 2015, the voice said quickly. "There was a case he buried, similar to your son's. The files are in the basement archive." Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, she called in sick to work and headed to the courthouse. With help from a sympathetic clerk, she found the records. What she discovered made her hands shake. Another case of a young black student, another questionable verdict, another life derailed. As she drove home that evening, Sarah noticed a black SUV following her. She took 3 extra turns to be sure. The message was clear. Her investigation was making powerful people nervous. But Sarah Johnson wasn't about to back down. She pulled into her driveway, grabbed her files, and walked into her house with her head held high. "They can try to scare me," she muttered to herself, adding the new case files to her collection, "but they don't know what it means to mess with a mother fighting for her child." Emma Harrison sat in the dimly lit law school library, her hands shaking as she stared at her laptop screen. What had started as a simple research project for her criminal justice class had turned into a life-changing discovery. She had chosen to analyze her father's sentencing patterns for her term paper, expecting to find evidence of his judicial wisdom. Instead, she found something that made her stomach turn. "This can't be right," she whispered to herself, double-checking the numbers for the fifth time. The statistics were clear. In cases involving black defendants under 25, her father's sentences were consistently more severe. The Marcus Johnson case from 3 months ago wasn't an exception, it was part of a pattern. The elegant Harrison family home felt different that evening as Emma walked through the front door. Family photos lined the hallway, her father in his judge's robes, family vacations, her law school acceptance celebration. Everything she once saw with pride now seemed tainted. Judge William Harrison sat in his usual leather chair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed case files. "There's my future lawyer," he called out cheerfully. "How's the term paper coming along?" Emma stood in the doorway, clutching her laptop. "Dad, we need to talk about your cases." Her father's smile faded slightly. "Oh, what about them?" "I've been analyzing your sentencing records," Emma said, her voice trembling. "The Marcus Johnson case made me curious, so I dug deeper." She opened her laptop and turned it toward him. "How do you explain this?" Judge Harrison's face hardened as he looked at the spreadsheet. "You're too young to understand the complexities of criminal justice, Emma. Statistics can be manipulated to show anything." "I'm not manipulating anything." Emma's voice rose. "These are your own records. Marcus Johnson had solid proof he was innocent, but you sent him to juvenile detention anyway, and he's not the only one." Her mother, Patricia Harrison, appeared in the doorway, attracted by the raised voices. "What's going on here?" "Our daughter seems to think she knows more about justice than a judge with 30 years of experience," Judge Harrison said coldly, closing Emma's laptop. "Dad, Marcus Johnson was working at the library when that theft happened. There were witnesses, security footage, everything. How could you ignore all that evidence?" Emma felt tears forming in her eyes. Emma Marie Harrison, her father stood up, his full height imposing. "You will not question my judicial decisions in my own house. I've spent my career protecting this community from criminals." "From criminals? Or from people who look different from us?" Emma shot back. "Because that's what the numbers show, Dad. That's what your own records show." Patricia tried to intervene. "Emma, honey, your father has always been fair." "No, Mom, he hasn't." Emma pulled out more papers from her bag. "Look at these cases. White defendants getting probation for the same crimes that send black defendants to jail. It's all here." Judge Harrison's face turned red. "That's enough. You're just a first-year law student. You don't understand the nuances of each case, the factors that go into these decisions." "What factors?" Emma demanded. "Their skin color, because that seems to be the biggest factor in your courtroom." The sound of Judge Harrison's hand slamming on his desk echoed through the room. "I will not be accused of racism in my own home, not by my own daughter." Emma stood her ground, though her whole body was shaking. "Then explain Marcus Johnson. Explain why you ignored all the evidence. Explain why a 16-year-old honor student is sitting in juvenile detention for a crime he couldn't have committed." Her father turned away, staring out the window. "Go to your room, Emma. We're done here." "No, Dad, we're not done." Emma gathered her things. "I'm leaving. I can't stay here tonight. I can't pretend this is okay anymore." "Emma, please," her mother pleaded. "Don't leave like this." But Emma was already heading for the door. As she reached for her car keys, she heard her father's voice, colder than she'd ever heard it. "If you walk out that door, don't expect any more support for law school." Emma paused, her hand on the doorknob. Years of love and respect for her father fought against what she knew was right. Then she thought of Marcus Johnson, sitting in a cell for something he didn't do, and made her choice. "Keep your money," she said quietly. "I'd rather struggle to pay for school than pretend I don't see what you're doing." She opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving behind a silence heavier than anything the Harrison home had ever known. The local Millbrook Gazette's office buzzed with unusual energy on a Wednesday morning. Reporter Michael Chen stared at his computer screen, reading through the email that had arrived anonymously the night before. The attachments contained court records, statistical analysis, and a disturbing pattern of judicial bias in Judge Harrison's courtroom. "Chief, you need to see this," Michael called to his editor, Linda Peters. He had spent the entire night verifying the information. "Remember that convenience store theft case? The one with the teenager, Marcus Johnson? It goes way deeper than we thought." Linda leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the documents. "Are these numbers verified?" "Triple-checked them myself," Michael replied. "And there's more." The convenience store owner finally agreed to talk. 2 hours later, Michael sat across from Mr. Thompson, the owner of Wilson's convenience store, in a quiet coffee shop. The elderly man fidgeted with his coffee cup, looking nervous. "I found the original security footage," Mr. Thompson said quietly, sliding a USB drive across the table. "The police only got the grainy copy, but this is the clear version from my backup system. I was scared to come forward before." Back at the office, Michael and Linda watched the crystal clear footage. It showed someone completely different from Marcus Johnson committing the theft, a shorter, lighter-skinned person wearing a distinctive red baseball cap. "Wait!" Linda pointed at the screen. "Freeze that frame." She squinted at the image. "That looks like Tommy Phillips. Isn't his father on the city council?" The investigation snowballed. More people started coming forward. Mrs. Chen from the dry cleaners across from Wilson's convenience store had seen Tommy Phillips running from the store that day. She had told the police, but her statement never made it into the official report. Meanwhile, Sarah Johnson's methodical documentation of Judge Harrison's cases had found its way to the State Judicial Review Board. The board couldn't ignore the overwhelming evidence. Hundreds of cases showing a clear pattern of discriminatory sentencing. Local TV stations picked up the story. The headline, "Justice in Black and White." A judge's controversial record flashed across screens throughout the state. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Free Marcus Johnson" and "Equal Justice for All." Emma Harrison watched the news coverage from her small apartment, where she'd been staying since leaving home. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Your father is furious. The whole town is talking about this." But Emma wasn't thinking about her father's reputation. She was thinking about Marcus Johnson, still sitting in juvenile detention despite mounting evidence of his innocence. She made a decision and dialed Michael Chen's number. "I have more information," she said when he answered, "about my father's cases, and I'm willing to go on record." The next morning's Gazette featured a powerful headline. "Judge's daughter speaks out. Pattern of bias cannot be ignored." Emma's brave testimony, combined with the statistical evidence and the new security footage, created a perfect storm. The district attorney's office couldn't ignore the situation any longer. They launched an official review of Marcus's case, along with dozens of others handled by Judge Harrison. In the juvenile detention center, Marcus sat in the common room, watching himself on the news. Other inmates gathered around, patting him on the back. His mother had visited the day before, telling him to stay strong, that the truth was finally coming out. Tommy Phillips, facing pressure from all sides, finally confessed. He admitted to the theft, revealing that he'd been struggling with a drug problem and needed money. His father's influence had helped keep him out of trouble until now. Judge Harrison's chambers, once a place of unquestioned authority, became eerily quiet. His secretary noticed him spending hours staring at old case files, particularly at Marcus Johnson's. The judge had always believed he was delivering justice, but now, faced with undeniable evidence of his bias, cracks began to show in his stern facade. The story reached national news outlets, civil rights organizations issued statements, and legal experts began examining similar patterns in other jurisdictions. What started as one mother's fight for her son had sparked a broader conversation about justice and racial bias in the legal system. Sarah Johnson stood in her living room, watching the coverage while touching the empty frame where Marcus's graduation photo should have been. "Hold on just a little longer, baby," she whispered. "The truth is finally coming out." Emma Harrison sat in the waiting room of the State Judicial Review Board building, her heart pounding against her ribs. The manila folder in her lap contained documents that could end her father's career, and her relationship with her family forever. Her testimony was scheduled for 10:00 a.m., and the clock on the wall showed 9:45. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her mother. "Please don't do this to your father. We can work this out as a family." Emma turned off her phone, remembering Marcus Johnson's mother crying in the courtroom 3 months ago. "Miss Harrison?" A woman in a navy blue suit appeared at the door. "The ward is ready for you." The hearing room was smaller than Emma had imagined, nothing like her father's grand courtroom. 5 board members sat behind a long table, their faces serious as they reviewed their papers. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. "Please state your name for the record," the chairwoman said, her voice gentle but firm. "Emma Marie Harrison, daughter of Judge William Harrison." Emma's voice shook slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "I'm a first-year law student at State University." "Miss Harrison, we understand this must be difficult for you," one of the male board members said. "Please take your time." Emma opened her folder and pulled out her research. "I discovered the pattern while doing research for a school project. At first, I didn't want to believe it." She passed copies of her analysis to the board members. "Over the past 10 years, my father has sentenced black defendants to terms averaging 65% longer than white defendants for the same crimes." The room was silent except for the clicking of the court reporter's machine. "In the case of Marcus Johnson," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger, "my father ignored substantial evidence of innocence. Security footage, multiple witnesses, and a solid alibi were all dismissed without proper consideration." Suddenly, the hearing room door opened. Emma's heart nearly stopped as her father walked in, followed by his attorney. Judge Harrison's face was ashen as he took a seat at the back of the room. Emma's hands trembled, but she pressed on. "I found similar patterns in dozens of cases. The Thompson case in 2018, the Rivera case in 2016, the Washington case in 2015. She listed each case, each injustice, aware of her father's eyes boring into her back. "The real theft suspect in the Johnson case has now confessed," she added. "Yet Marcus Johnson remains in juvenile detention because my father refuses to acknowledge his mistake." For the next 2 hours, Emma answered the board's questions, explaining her research methodology, providing specific examples, and sharing personal observations of her father's behavior on the bench. She could hear her father shifting in his seat behind her, clearing his throat occasionally. As the hearing neared its end, the chairwoman asked one final question. "Miss Harrison, what motivated you to come forward?" Emma finally turned to look at her father. Their eyes met across the room. "I was raised to believe in justice," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My father taught me that. He used to tell me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. Today, I'm living by those words, even if he no longer does." Judge Harrison's face crumpled for a moment before he quickly composed himself. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head slightly, his eyes never leaving his daughter. Outside the hearing room, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Emma slipped out through a side door, but not before hearing the board's chairwoman announce that a full investigation would be launched into all of Judge Harrison's cases from the past decade. In the parking lot, Emma found Sarah Johnson waiting by her car. They had never spoken before, but Sarah had reached out after reading Emma's newspaper interview. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, her eyes filled with tears. "What you did in there. Not everyone would be strong enough." Emma felt her own tears finally start to fall. "I kept thinking about Marcus, about all of them. Someone had to speak up." Sarah hugged her tightly. "You're not alone in this. You did the right thing." As Emma drove home to her small apartment, she passed her childhood house. The porch light was on. Her mother always kept it on for her. But tonight, like every night since she decided to testify, she drove past without stopping. Some choices change everything, and there's no going back. The day Marcus Johnson walked out of juvenile detention, the sky was a brilliant blue. He squinted in the bright sunlight, still wearing his detention center uniform because the clothes he came in with no longer fit. 3 months of confinement had changed him. He was thinner, quieter, his eyes carrying a wariness that hadn't been there before. Sarah Johnson waited by her car, trying to hold back tears as she watched her son walk towards her. Behind her stood Mr. Rodriguez, their lawyer, holding a folder containing Marcus's release papers and the court's official apology. "Baby," Sarah whispered, wrapping her arms around Marcus. He felt smaller, more fragile than she remembered. "Let's go home." The drive home was quiet. Marcus stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. They had missed his 17th birthday last week, The celebration would come later. Right now, he just needed time to process everything. Meanwhile, across town, Judge William Harrison sat alone in his chambers, staring at the suspension notice on his desk. The State Judicial Review Board's investigation had been swift and thorough. They had reviewed over 400 of his cases, finding clear evidence of racial bias in his sentencing patterns. His phone rang, another reporter seeking comment. He let it go to voicemail, just like the dozens of other calls. The local newspaper's headline that morning read, "Judge Harrison suspended pending full investigation of discriminatory sentencing." A knock on his door made him look up. It was Patricia, his wife, carrying a small box. "They want you to clear out your office by tomorrow," she said softly. "Emma called. She wanted to know if you're okay." Judge Harrison's hands trembled as he picked up a framed photo from his desk. Emma's law school acceptance celebration. "I didn't see it," he whispered. "Or maybe I didn't want to see it. All these years." At the Johnson house, Marcus sat on his bed, touching his belongings as if making sure they were real. His basketball trophies, his science fair medals, his college application essays. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. But he wasn't the same person who had left this room 3 months ago. "Marcus," his mother called from downstairs, "someone's here to see you." He walked downstairs to find Emma Harrison standing in their living room. Marcus recognized her from the courtroom, but she looked different now, less polished, more human. "I wanted to apologize," Emma said, her voice shaking slightly. "What my father did to you. I'm so sorry." Marcus studied her face. "You risked everything to tell the truth. You don't need to apologize." The State Judicial Review Board wasn't finished. They ordered mandatory sensitivity training for all judges in the district. Judge Harrison's cases from the past decade would be reviewed by an independent panel. Some sentences might be reduced or overturned entirely. That evening, Judge Harrison sat in his study at home, watching the local news coverage of Marcus's release. The reporter interviewed Marcus briefly as he left the detention center. "What are your plans now?" the reporter had asked. "I'm going to finish high school," Marcus had replied. "Then law school. Someone needs to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The judge turned off the TV, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. He scrolled to Emma's number, hesitated, then typed, "You were right. I was wrong. I'm sorry." 3 minutes later, his phone buzzed with her reply, "It's not me you need to apologize to." In his room, Marcus opened his laptop for the first time since his release. Hundreds of messages waited, from classmates, teachers, and strangers who had followed his story. One message caught his eye, from a local civil rights organization offering him an internship. Sarah watched her son from the doorway, seeing him smile for the first time since his release. The fight wasn't over. There were still hundreds of cases to review, lives to rebuild, and a system to reform. But tonight, her son was home. Across town, Judge Harrison stood in his empty chambers one last time. He picked up the last photo from his desk, himself in his judge's robes on the day he was appointed. He had been so proud then, so certain of his righteousness. Now, that certainty was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of recognition. As he turned out the lights, he finally understood that true justice required more than just following the law. It required looking into one's own heart and acknowledging the prejudices that lived there. 5 years moved quickly. Marcus Johnson straightened his tie as he walked through the halls of State University Law School. At 22, he carried himself with quiet confidence, his detention center ID card kept in his wallet as a reminder of how far he'd come. The lecture hall was packed when he reached the podium. As a third-year law student, he'd been invited to speak about juvenile justice reform. In the audience, he spotted his mother, Sarah, who now ran a nonprofit organization helping families affected by judicial bias. "My story begins with an injustice," Marcus started, his voice strong and clear. "But it doesn't end there." He shared his experience, watching as students furiously took notes. Some of them had studied his case in their criminal justice classes. Across the state at Carter Law School, Emma Harrison was also making waves. Her thesis on racial bias in judicial decision-making had caught the attention of the Innocence Project. Today, she sat in their office, reviewing cases similar to Marcus's. "We've identified 15 more cases from your father's court that need immediate review," her supervisor said, placing a stack of files on her desk. Emma nodded, reaching for the first file. Her father's signature was at the bottom of each sentencing document, a reminder of why she chose this path. Later that afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected email. The State Bar Association wanted him to lead a youth mentorship program for aspiring lawyers from underprivileged backgrounds. As he read the email, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Turn on Channel 4 now," her message read. The news showed Judge Harrison, looking older and more humble, speaking at a judicial reform conference. It was his first public appearance since completing his sensitivity training and counseling program. "My own prejudices blinded me to true justice," Judge Harrison admitted to the audience. "It took losing everything, my position, my reputation, and most importantly, my daughter's respect, to see the truth." Marcus watched the screen, remembering the man who had sentenced him without a second thought. The judge looked different now, his arrogance replaced by what seemed like genuine remorse. That evening, Emma sat in her small apartment, surrounded by case files. Her father's words from the conference played on her laptop. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she listened to him acknowledge his mistakes publicly for the first time. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. "I saw your father's speech," he said. "Me too," Emma replied. "Do you think people can really change?" "I have to believe they can," Marcus answered. "Otherwise, what are we fighting for?" The next morning, Marcus visited his old juvenile detention center, now as a legal advocate. He walked through the same halls where he'd once been imprisoned, speaking with young inmates, sharing his story, offering hope. In one cell, he met a 16-year-old boy who reminded him of himself. The boy had been sentenced by another judge with a history of harsh sentencing for minority youth. Marcus took out his notepad, just as Emma had taught him to document everything. Meanwhile, Emma faced her own challenges at the Innocence Project. Some colleagues questioned her commitment, wondering if she was trying to atone for her father's sins. But with each case she helped overturn, she proved herself. During lunch, she received an unexpected call from her mother. "Your father's been asked to speak at schools about bias in the justice system," Patricia said. "He wanted to know if you'd help him prepare his talks." Emma sat silent for a moment. "Tell them I'll think about it." That afternoon, Marcus and Emma met at their usual coffee shop. They'd formed an unlikely friendship, bound by their shared commitment to justice reform. Both had chosen paths that put them at odds with their family's expectations. Marcus could have pursued a safer career. Emma could have joined a prestigious law firm. "I got the grant," Marcus announced, sliding the approval letter across the table. The funding would help establish a legal clinic for juvenile defendants. Emma smiled. "We're really doing this, aren't we? Making changes in the system." "One case at a time," Marcus nodded. "It's not fast enough, but it's happening." As they discussed their plans, neither could have imagined this partnership 5 years ago, the wrongly convicted teenager and the judge's daughter, working together to fix a broken system. Their paths to redemption weren't just about themselves anymore. They were about creating the justice system they wished had existed when Marcus first stood in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The State Judicial Reform Conference buzzed with excitement. The main hall was packed with judges, lawyers, and activists from across the country. On stage, 2 names appeared on the digital screen. Keynote speakers, Marcus Johnson and Emma Harrison, building a new path to justice. Marcus, now a graduating law student and youth justice advocate, adjusted his microphone. At 22, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had turned pain into purpose. Emma stood beside him, her work with the Innocence Project having helped free 12 wrongfully convicted juveniles in the past year. In the front row, Sarah Johnson sat proudly, holding hands with Mrs. Wilson, the librarian who had never stopped supporting them. Behind them sat Patricia Harrison and, to everyone's surprise, Judge William Harrison himself, looking older and humbler in a simple gray suit. 5 years ago, Marcus began, I stood in a courtroom, watching my future disappear because of one man's bias. His eyes met Judge Harrison's briefly. But today, I'm not here to talk about that injustice. I'm here to talk about change. Emma stepped forward. When I first discovered my father's biased sentencing patterns, I thought exposing the truth would be enough. But we've learned that true change requires more than just revealing injustice. It requires rebuilding the entire system. they unveiled their new initiative, the Second Chance Youth Justice Program. The program would provide legal support, education opportunities, and mentorship for juveniles in the justice system, with a special focus on addressing systemic bias. From his seat, Judge Harrison listened as his daughter and Marcus described cases similar to what he had presided over. Each story hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to stay, to bear witness. Our program has already received support from 30 judges who have committed to examining their own biases, Marcus announced. And today, we're adding another name to that list. The audience murmured as Judge Harrison stood up slowly. He walked to the stage, each step heavy with the weight of his past actions. Marcus and Emma moved aside, letting him approach the microphone. "I am William Harrison," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Some of you know me as the judge who sent an innocent teenager to juvenile detention. Others know me as the father whose daughter had the courage to stand up against injustice." He paused, gathering himself. "Today, I stand before you not as a judge, but as a man asking for the chance to help fix what I helped break." Sarah Johnson watched as her son stepped forward and shook hands with the man who had wronged him. The gesture wasn't forgiveness. It was something more powerful, acknowledgement that change was possible. After the conference, they gathered in a small meeting room. Judge Harrison faced Marcus directly for the first time since the sentencing. "I've spent 5 years in counseling, learning about my biases," the judge said quietly. "But nothing taught me more than watching you turn my injustice into something positive." Marcus nodded. "The system didn't break me, Judge Harrison. Instead, it showed me what needed to be fixed." Emma hugged her father for the first time in years. Patricia wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her family slowly beginning to heal. The next day, local newspapers carried the story. Former judge joins forces with man he wrongly convicted. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small details. It was in the way Marcus now mentored young people in trouble with the law. It was in how Emma had found her true calling helping others seek justice. It was in how Judge Harrison now spoke at schools about recognizing and confronting personal bias. As they left the conference center, Marcus and Emma walked with their families, no longer separate units bound by an injustice, but partners in creating change. "You know," Marcus said, looking at the sunset, "when I was in detention, I never imagined this ending." Emma smiled. "Maybe it's not an ending. Maybe it's just the beginning." Sarah Johnson took one last photo, her son and Emma standing with their new Youth Justice Program banner, Judge Harrison in the background, all of them focused on the future rather than the past. The story of a racist judge and an innocent black youth that transformed into something larger, a testament to the possibility of change, the power of truth, and the long, hard road to justice. As they walked away together, they carried with them the knowledge that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was still in their hands.